state progress on workforce data. I'm going to take a few moments and just tell you a little bit about Workforce Data Quality Campaign and what our discussion was going to cover today. So about WDQC. We advocate for inclusive, aligned, and market-relevant education and workforce data that can help our nation's human capital policies meet the challenges of a changing economy. We work at both the federal and state levels on policy reforms that will promote useful information for policymakers, students and workers, business leaders, and educators. At the federal level, we work on federal legislation, funding that supports the development of state longitudinal data systems, and work with agencies on thinking about ways to provide technical assistance to states to improve their workforce data infrastructure. Our policy agenda was developed by a broad coalition of national organizations, state leaders, and technical experts who represent expertise across the education and workforce spectrum. At the state level, we promote a state blueprint that has 13 key features of a high-quality data infrastructure. And the state blueprint forms the foundation for the survey that WDQC did, and that we'll be talking about more today. So the partners that I referenced earlier who influence our policy agenda, National Skills Coalition, the Association for Career and Technical Education, the Institute for Higher Education Policy, the National Association for State Workforce Agencies, the Association of Public Data Users, Council for Community and Economic Research, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, New America Foundation, the National Association of State Directors of Career and Technical Education, the Data Quality Campaign, and CLASP. And we are supported by several foundations who make our work possible: the Apollo Education Group, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Joyce Foundation, and the Lumina Foundation. So our presenters for today, our first presenter will be Michelle Massey, policy analyst for WDQC, who did all of the hard work of surveying states and analyzing the results. She will be followed by state presenters from Utah, Erica Lee Oriens, Research Coordinator for the Utah Education Policy Center, and Albert Tay, Utah Data Alliance Project Manager for the Utah State Office of Education. And finally, Jessica Fraser, Project Manager for the Indiana Institute for Working Families, will provide some advice about how these survey results might be used in an advocacy context. So, Michelle, I will turn the presentation over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Rachel. Last month, WDQC released the report, Mastering the Blueprint, State Progress on Workforce Data. The cover is right here on the slide, so you can take a look at that. The report highlighted the numerous efforts that are being undertaken to demonstrate the effective uses and linkages of workforce data throughout the country. The report was based on a nationwide survey conducted by WDQC in which states rated their progress on a 13-point blueprint for strong data systems. And Rachel alluded to that blueprint earlier in the introduction. The scope and methodology that we used in preparing the survey and the report are as follows. In early 2014, we conducted an informal survey of 16 states that WDQC had been working with to assess their progress on implementing the blueprint elements. And due to the strong response from those initial states, we launched an ambitious effort to survey over 50 states and the District of Columbia to obtain a baseline of state progress. WDQC distributed the survey to state data leaders in the spring of this year, and those leaders held positions at a variety of entities throughout the states which were involved in state data systems, including state workforce and education agencies, community colleges, and state commerce departments. Responses were then collected throughout the summer months and prepared for public dissemination by early fall. The state data leaders from 40 states plus the District of Columbia responded to the survey, so we're very excited by the level of response that we got through this survey. The survey highlighted the numerous efforts that were being undertaken, again, to demonstrate the effective usage uses and data linkage of workforce data, and it really gave us an opportunity of the work that was being done on the state and local levels. Of all of the respondents, which again were 41 in total, they ranked themselves on a 3-point scale to illustrate their progress on each component of the blueprint. And the scale is available here on the slide. So it was a very non-scientific study. We asked states to look at themselves in regards to not started, minimum progress, in progress, and achieved, mostly achieved. The WDQC survey adds to a growing body of knowledge about the advancement of state data systems. The Data Quality Campaign issues an annual survey of the states which focuses on the use of education data in the K-12 system. The State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, or SHEO, periodically conducts a national study of state-level post-secondary student unit record data systems. And the Early Childhood Data Collaborative often surveys states about early child care and education data. So the WDQC survey really helps to enrich the full spectrum of the state data systems. Next slide, please. The key findings of the report were quite interesting. The report includes some promising practices from several states that illustrate how they are implementing elements from the blueprint, and our presenters today will touch more on that, so I won't go into too much detail. But there have been some really great strides in a few areas of our blueprint, including knowing if graduates get jobs. In fact, the survey found that of the total respondents, 37 are moving toward tracking whether education and workforce program participants move on to get employment with good earnings. So we're really excited about that. And 36 states report taking steps, sometimes through legislative action, to establish cross-agency councils to oversee statewide data collection and reporting efforts. And of those, 20 states, which was the highest for any element, say they have achieved an inclusive council. The intention is that this report will serve as a baseline so that future WDQC surveys can measure how states are improving on different dimensions of the blueprint. So we don't want this to be a standalone document. We really see this as a living document that's going to have some legs over time. We also want to use this report as a tool to continue our engagement with states and raise awareness of our blueprint. And again, we'll have a speaker talk about that later in the webinar. We'll continue to keep an eye on those elements that offer opportunities for improvement, such as metrics for career pathways and cross-state sharing of employment data. There's still a lot of potential growth as it relates to states achieving their workforce data goals. So we're looking forward to working with more states in the future. Pardon me. The report also helped to identify states that are using good models that could be studied or possibly replicated by other states. For example, North Dakota has a state labor agency that administers several workforce programs, including Unemployment Insurance, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, Wagner-Pfizer, and Trade Adjustment Assistance. Data on participants in these programs is being incorporated into a data warehouse, which will protect individual privacy while storing longitudinal wage records and program participant data. This workforce data will be linked to educational data in the existing state data system according to the conditions of an interagency data sharing agreement. Minnesota also exhibited a best practice. The Minnesota legislature approved $882,000 in fiscal year 2014 and the same amount in fiscal year 2015 to the Minnesota Office of Higher Education and the Minnesota Office of Enterprise Technology to maintain the infrastructure of the state's longitudinal educational data system and to acquire additional data through purchase and development. So that's outstanding in terms of state funding or committed state funding. And finally, Arizona stood out as a best practice for its LMI capacity and use. Arizona's Department of Administration's Office of Employment and Population Statistics maintains a publicly accessible website containing state labor market information. Some of the labor market and demographic information for Arizona, which is available on this site, includes local area employment and unemployment statistics, occupation and industry employment estimates and projections, wage survey data, and population data. So these are the types of data that can really help people to better understand the state's economy and make informed labor market choices. So there's a lot more information like that available in the report, so we hope everyone on the webinar will, if you haven't already read it or downloaded it, hopefully you'll do so following today's webinar. Next slide. At this time, I would like to hand over the presentation to Eric and Albert, who will share some best practices from the state of Utah. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate your introduction. Michelle asked Albert and I from the state of Utah to talk about our responses to the Workforce Data Quality Campaign and some of the work that's going on in Utah. Like I said, my name is Erica Oriens. I'm the research coordinator for the Utah Data Alliance, and I'm joined today by Albert Tay, who's the project manager. And Albert just joined our project this summer, and I've been involved for a couple of years. So I'll be doing most of the talking today, and he'll jump in when necessary. You can go to the next slide. So I just to start out, I want to give a little bit of background on Utah's project. So the Utah Data Alliance is Utah's statewide longitudinal data system. In Utah, we have branded our SLDS, the Utah Data Alliance, because Utah is also home to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is abbreviated LDS, and we wanted to avoid confusion between our organization and the LDS Church. And so that's why you'll hear us refer to ourselves as the UDA, or the Utah Data Alliance. I wanted to just point out with our mission, that last sentence there that we really find to be important in our project, which is to provide policy and decision makers research findings with the goal of improving education and workforce policy and practice in the state of Utah. And that's really important to us, and something as we produce things that we keep central in thinking about what we're doing is how that will help education and workforce policy in Utah. Okay, you can advance the slide. In the state of Utah, the UDA is made up of 6 partner agencies. The Utah State Office of Education represents public education. In the state of Utah, we have 2 systems of higher education. The Utah System of Higher Education represents our 8 public institutions, and the Utah College of Applied Technology represents our technology campuses. Of course, the Department of Workforce Services provides the workforce data that we have in our database. The Utah Education Network manages our database, the actual physical database, and the Utah Education Policy Center focuses on the research aspects of the project. So those are just a little bit about the partners in our organization. You can advance the slide. And so when Michelle contacted us, she asked that we talk about a few of the items that we've achieved in the state of Utah based on the WDQC state blueprint. And so for the rest of my presentation, I want to focus on those 4 items that are listed underneath ensuring data access and appropriate use. And I'll just talk about how we have sort of implemented those things in the state of Utah. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So the first thing I wanted to display to you is the what WDQC talked about, the scorecards for students and workers. On the UDA website at utahdataalliance.org, we display for anyone, so students, workers, policymakers, whoever goes to our website, a dashboard that talks about post-secondary graduates by area of study and then their wages in the workforce if they stayed in the state of Utah. I would just say first that we don't really characterize this as a scorecard. We're not really it's not really set up to encourage students to necessarily compare between institutions, but I do think it's a really great resource to be able to show students if they select an area of study, which we use that based on the zip code in which the student graduated from, they can see first-year and fifth-year wages for students who stayed in the state of Utah that are included in our database. They can also drill down and select an institution to see kind of what those differences are. We developed this. It displays the median wages here and developed, if you want to go to the next slide, We also developed kind of a companion dashboard to go along with that displays for users the industry where the student is employed in their first year after graduation. And so in this case, what you're seeing here is I selected an area of study of business, management, marketing, and related support services for those students who graduated from the University of Utah in 2012. And this bubble chart here will display the industry in which the person is employed 1 year after graduation. And so if, as we're looking through this gives students an idea of where individuals are employed. We use Tableau for our dashboards, and so it's not very interesting to look at these in a PowerPoint presentation, but if I invite you to go out to our website and play around with it a little bit to get an idea of what we're able to share. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Another item in the WDQC blueprint was feedback reports to programs and institutions. I think this is another area where Utah, we've done some really interesting things. What I'm displaying here is an image of Utah's third annual report on intergenerational poverty, welfare dependency, and the use of public assistance, their 2014 report. And the way our state longitudinal data system contributed to that is in the state of Utah, intergenerational poverty has been kind of a popular topic in the last couple of years that our state legislature has considered funding various initiatives. And they were definitely interested in education outcomes for those young people that were affected by intergenerational poverty or on public assistance. And so the Department of Workforce Services provided the UDA with a list of individuals affected by intergenerational poverty or on public assistance. And then we found those students in the Utah Data Alliance database and were able to report some of their academic achievement outcomes, attendance information that we have in the database, which I think is really important, not only a feedback to the program, but also to be able to create legislation in the future, to be able to fund programs, to know where to target programs. I think is another great way that we're able to contribute to that. The next slide displays another example of what we've done, providing feedback to programs, or excuse me, to institutions of higher education. So this is an example of, obviously it's just here in Excel, but it's feedback that we provided to an institution of higher education in Utah that provided post-secondary enrollment information by district and school, and then disaggregated by ACT score, so to see kind of where those students were attending college. So another great way that we're able to collaborate with institutions of higher education. The next slide talks about how we're able to provide data for policymakers. We like to think that we don't only provide data, but we also provide some synthesis of the evidence about policy issues, the policy context and background of the issues in Utah. This slide displays a couple examples of this. On the left is a policy brief that we created where we did an analysis of students who dropped out of high school, and we wanted to look at their post-secondary, or excuse me, we wanted to look at their educational experiences after they dropped out of high school. And out of this study, we found that 53% of Utah high school dropouts actually continued their education through adult basic education or post-secondary education after they dropped out of high school. And I think this was really helpful to help people understand that high school dropout isn't necessarily the end of the education pipeline, that there are ways to engage students even after they've dropped out of high school. The image on the right displays a graph in one of our policy briefs that focuses on chronic absenteeism. So another initiative in Utah of concern over the last couple of years was students who are chronically absent from school, meaning they miss more than 10% of the school year, of the days in which they're enrolled. This particular graph here displays some of the characteristics of those students who are kind of a creative way of displaying some of the characteristics of those students who were chronically absent. You can find both of these briefs on our website. And I think the information that was helpful to fund various different kinds of bills that were under consideration in Utah. The next slide talks about securing state funding. This was the last area underneath that in the Workforce Data Quality Campaign. During the 2014 legislative session, the UDA was thrilled to secure ongoing funding from the legislature for our project. It was funded under a bill called Senate Bill 34, which was the Statewide Data Alliance and Utah Futures. Utah Futures is a different program in Utah, but they just came under the same bill. In Utah, we found a champion in Senator Howard Stevenson, who was interested in sponsoring a bill for the UDA to be able to move forward. The UDA received a grant from the Statewide Longitudinal Data System in 2009, and those grant funds expired on June 30th, 2014. So we needed to find funding from somewhere, and we had an opportunity that the Utah State Legislature funded us in ongoing funds for 2014 moving forward. You can also, I provide a reference there where you can find information about Senate Bill 34 online. So you can advance to the next slide. I would invite you to check out our website at utahdataalliance.org. It shares a lot of the information that I shared with you today is available on our website. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact Albert or I. Our email addresses will be included in the slide deck that they share.
Okay, are we moving just on to me then?
Yep, it's all yours, Jessica. Take it away.
Okay, I'm sorry. I wasn't sure if Albert was going to add anything. Okay, so my name is Jessica Fraser, and I'm with the Indiana Institute for Working Families. We are a research and advocacy group dedicated to helping low-income families achieve and maintain self-sufficiency here in Indiana. And through that work, you can advance the slide, we got involved in the Skills to Compete Coalition with the National Skills Coalition, and so we have been engaged in trying to advance higher education policy and workforce development policy in Indiana, and our coalition has 27 members representing 22 organizations. The Chamber of Commerce is involved. We have agency members from the Commission on Higher Ed and the Department of Workforce Development. Both of our community colleges systems are involved. And we have legislators from each of the 4 caucuses. So that has been a really great partnership in trying to move forward on workforce development policy, and part of that is, of course, data. And so we worked over the last couple of years on trying to do some cross-agency credential measurements, and our state has just recently put together a new approach to our longitudinal data system. We had one in the past. It was called the Indiana Workforce Intelligence System, and our new one is called INC. And so that's just getting off the ground, and no one's quite sure exactly what form it's going to take or what all the possibilities are with it. So it's a really good time right now to be looking at this blueprint. You can go on to the next one, Yuri. It's a good time to be looking at this blueprint and seeing what other people are going on. And I completely agree with Erica's, all the great things that Erica was saying, the hope and the promise that data can give us this really timely, good information to be making these policy decisions. And so we're really excited and hope that data policy moves forward here in Indiana. And so I just wanted to share with everyone some of the things that are priorities for us and how I envision myself using, and I've already started using, the blueprint since it came out last month. So we got a bill for cross-agency credential measurement. We do have a cross-agency council, and the implementation of our measurement process has not exactly been everything that we had hoped it would be, but we have really great partners at the state, so we're working on trying to get all the pieces together. As many of you probably know, some of the more diverse credentials are really hard to capture. So we're still working on that. And then, which just goes into the next one, how do we capture those industry-recognized credentials, and how do we make sure we're counting all of the credentials that are important to the workforce here in Indiana and may be part of where a skills gap is happening, and then analyzing the industry skills gaps. Those are the three main things that we're really worried about. A fourth one that I should have probably added was the metrics for career pathways, which is one of the items on the blueprint. So I guess the way that I have been looking at this report is that, first of all, there were some surprises on our score sheet for here in Indiana for me. There were some things that I didn't realize we were as far along the way on. And so I definitely have been following up on that and trying to understand what's happening that maybe I wasn't aware of, or in what way are we mostly achieved, and is that progress something that fits in with how we were hoping things would go. And then the second thing is just looking at all these other states that are further along the line than we are, that have the achieved and mostly achieved, and reaching out and figuring out how to get in touch with them and finding out what they're doing, and if the way they're approaching their that particular item on the blueprint is something that would work here in Indiana, and seeing if they can talk to our policy folks and our state folks and get some synergy around moving some of those things forward. So I'm really excited about the blueprint, and I'm excited to dig in, especially on the capturing diverse credentials, and find people who are a little further down the line on that, and see if we can't learn from each other and steal what they've done and not recreate the wheel. So that's really all that I have. We can go on to questions.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, everyone, so much. And here's our contact information for Rachel and Michelle if you have questions. If you don't get to hear, if you don't get your question answered today while we're on the phone, we do have about 20 minutes left for questions, so we should be able to fit most folks in. But if you don't, feel free to follow up with either Michelle or Rachel, and we will put you in touch with the right panelists and answer your questions the best we can. So why don't we move on to Q&A. So I believe that, folks, if you want to raise your hand on the webinar, you can do that, and I can unmute your phone, or you can type in your question, and we will put it in the queue. So we have a question from Steve King, who wanted to have our presenters from Utah talk a little bit more about how you are getting the employment outcome data that you're using in your reports.
So in Utah, our database is a state longitudinal data system. So we have records from public education, education records from post-secondary education, and then we partner with the Department of Workforce Services, and they provide for us quarterly wages in the industry code in which the person is working. That comes in, so our education data is loaded annually, and along with that is our workforce data is provided by the Department of Workforce Services. I hope that answers your question. Let me know if you need more detail.
Okay, that should be great. I'm sure Steve will type back in if he has further follow-up. We have a question from Jennifer Pritchard, who wanted to hear a little bit more about studies that have analyzed industry skills gaps. I'm not sure if this is something that Utah or Indiana have seen. Michelle, I think you have other examples from additional states as well. Anyone want to jump in on this question?
I can jump in for a second. I've been looking for the same thing, and our state is getting ready to do a demand study. So hopefully we'll have something soon. But one of the things that I've been really interested in is looking at at sort of upcoming attrition numbers and age distributions. And I haven't heard of people doing that, because when I go around and talk to employers, I hear all the time about these large numbers of middle-skilled workers that are eligible for retirement in manufacturing. And so I guess I'm answering your question to say that, yes, that's really needed, and I hope that that the data systems can start to do some of that a little bit better. And I'm happy to follow up and put in touch with what Indiana's working on their current demand study.
And this is Michelle. The state of Florida has created supply-demand model that really allows policymakers to better align education and training supply with actual employer demand. So those reports have been pretty interesting. And the state of Mississippi uses its state longitudinal data system, which is known as LifeTracks, as a marketing tool for the expansion of jobs in the state. And I think one of the examples that Mississippi likes to use, and it's a strong example, was the Yokohama Tire Corporation. When they were looking to build a new manufacturing plant, they wanted to make sure the state could provide the number of jobs and skilled workers to fill those jobs. And so Mississippi was able to look at that kind of industry skills gap within their state and assure Yokohama that they would indeed have the supply of workers and skilled workers to fill those jobs. So those are a couple of examples as well.
Great, thank you. And have a question from Hans Lorange, who was wondering, Michelle, this one is for you, whether you were surprised at the high number of states that report that they are either able to or are working on being able to measure employment outcomes using the UI wage data.
I would say that we were pleasantly surprised, because we're noticing that this is definitely an area of interest, and it's an area that policymakers and consumers alike are interested in. And I think it also shows that there's been more cooperation in terms of being able to work across the agencies and give the employment data that is necessary, the UI wage data that is necessary to create these kind of outcome reports. One of the key things is that we've seen this trend through like college measures in a couple of other states that have just, California, I believe Rhode Island. There's a couple of states that have built their own sites to do these kind of employment tracking. And so I think it's just the way and the trend that people want information, and they want good information, and they want to be able to use that information to make the best decisions possible. So I don't think it was a surprise, but we want to make sure that the uptrend continues.
That's great. And Michelle, there have been a couple follow-up questions asking about the privacy concerns and how the UI wage data is able to be matched with student data or workforce participant data, and how that's been able to be done given privacy concerns. So I can jump in on that. So the way that's been able to happen is because the data is matched individually, and it's only a few people can see the individual data, and then actually a lot of the matching happens automatically, so no one sees it, and then only the aggregate data is released. So for instance, average earnings will be released for programs of study. So when you're releasing aggregate data, you're not compromising individual privacy and the security of confidential data. So did that cover it, Michelle? I think that's...
Yeah, I think that was pretty succinct, yeah.
Great. And we have a question for Utah as well. Curious about, again, earnings information. So does Utah make earnings information available for programs of study within Utah post-secondary institutions? And do you know much about how students are actually using this information?
I do not know how much students are using this information. I hope that students are using it in concert with other pieces of information that will help them either decide what they want to major in, decide what the wages are about. We try to be very careful to share with the public the limitations of what we're able to provide and how they should use this. We do, I think part of the question was, are people using it within institutions? We do disaggregate by institutions when we're looking at those areas of study or the zip code, a person can drill down into the institution that where those students graduated. So we can drill down into that level. It's hard to say. I mean, we don't get a lot of hits on our website, I would say, but we have gotten some good feedback from people that this information has been useful, and I think policymakers are very interested in it as well. They see it as a good opportunity for kind of public disclosure of data.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from Brenda Beverly, who asks, what progress is being made on cross-state sharing of employment data, so sharing of wage data across state lines?
And this is Michelle. I think one of the things we can point to is RIS2. And WDQC released a paper earlier this year about RIS2 as well. And I'm just trying to recall from memory, but I believe, is it 34 states that are currently?
I think it's up to 35 or 36 now. One or two hopped on.
And for those who aren't familiar, RIS2 is the wage records interchange system, too. And it allows states within certain parameters to be able to exchange that data with each other so that they can do that kind of cross-state tracking and, being able to follow, I hate to use the word follow, but being able to see where participants are moving and being able to track those wages. Now, one of the limitations, of course, is participation in RIS2. So states are members, but are they exchanging data? What are the matches that they're finding on those data? And so there's still some limitations to the system, but we strongly encourage all states to participate in RIS2 because it is a step in the right direction. And we also look at, as a campaign, WDQC, we're looking at other ways of exchanging information like regional data sharing agreements as well. And so we try to promote those kind of efforts, and we have seen some measurable progress in that. Rachel, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add to that.
No, that's great. And I'm going to switch gears because we're getting a couple of questions about employer job posting data and whether and how states are using data from employer job postings from vendors like Burning Glass in order to think about aligning programs with labor market needs, and how is that data used to complement other data sources like data available from Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys. I don't know if, Erica, do you have thoughts about whether Utah has tapped into job posting data? I guess people also call it real-time labor market information.
I can't speak to that. I think possibly the Department of Workforce Services has pursued that in the past, but I'm not familiar with it.
Okay.
There are definitely some folks using it in Indiana. Our State Chamber of Commerce has a web tool that they have available, and I'm totally blanking on what they call it. Oh my goodness! But you can search, like the top 5 certificates or the top 10 certificates being requested by employers in real-time data through a partnership that they have with Burning Glass. So I know it's being used. As far as how the state is using it, I'm not 100% sure about that. So, but I know that we know about it here, and it's getting around.
Great, thanks. And we have a question from James Parker for Utah. Has your dropout data helped improve funding for adult education? And do you know of any other states doing similar studies?
We just did this study. I think we published it in the spring. And so we haven't, and we published it after the legislative session, so we haven't seen a lot of action from it yet. We have found that, high school dropout, it's not a very popular topic in terms of interventions in education, but I think it definitely could be used to improve outcomes not for adult basic education and for post-secondary institutions to reach out to students who have dropped out from high school, that that's not a lost group of students. There is a community of people across the nation that focus on dropout prevention, and I think that the work that we've done with that has been really helpful to them as more evidence about not only dropout prevention, but the opportunities for students after they drop out from high school. I'll be interested to see in this legislative session if there's any appetite for improving funding for adult basic education in Utah.
Great. And we have a question from Danielle Avenue, who is asking, regarding interagency governance councils, what elements are necessary for these structures to be successful? So that's a great question because both Utah and Indiana have interesting governance councils. So Jessica, you want to start with that one? What have you seen about your state's council?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our council was legislated last year, and the governor is the chair of it with the lieutenant governor as the co-chair. So I think that's really important because you have top leadership with a lot of buy-in and a lot of buy-in, but also responsibility for how things happen, and then having all the agency heads around the table. And at least the way it's played out in our state is that they're not sending delegates. The agency heads themselves have been coming to each meeting and being really engaged, at least for the most part. So that has been really encouraging because I think the buck stops with them, and you need that upper level engagement, high leadership level engagement. So far it's going really well in Indiana. I've been really encouraged by the strategic plan that the Career Council has come out with, and the direction and the importance that they're putting on the data policy stuff. But we're just at the point where they just finished their strategic plan, and they just finished the strategic plan, and there's going to be legislation and recommendations coming out of the Career Council going to the legislature with this upcoming session. So it's still pretty new. We'll have to see how successful they can be in leveraging this stuff into a statute coming up in the next year.
Great. And Erica, what have you seen from the Utah Data Alliance? What features of that collaboration has allowed it to be successful and move forward with the data usage?
I think, unlike Indiana, Utah does not have a legislatively mandated P20W council or anything like that. Our organization is really an organization that came together through collaboration from those 6 organizations that I talked about. I think that one thing that's been really successful for us is each of those agencies coming together and really supporting each other's initiatives. And so when we're talking about doing longitudinal studies and we're looking at public ed to post-secondary or post-secondary to workforce outcomes, I think the biggest advantage that we've had in Utah is that we are able to support each other's projects. So, I mean, it's a lot of detail, but one of the biggest hurdles is even just understanding what things mean, what data elements mean in other agencies, because it's not always what you assume. And so I think one of the biggest things for us has been, like for example, I know in projects that I've worked with, working with our partners in post-secondary education and them educating us on what some of their data elements mean and how we can interpret those has been really helpful for us.
Great, thank you. Getting some questions about, I think Michelle, this is probably for you. Given what you found through the survey, how ready are states to implement the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act?
Yes, that is a very popular question these days. And the short answer is it really depends on the state. Some states will be early implementers while others are really going to wait for the regulations to be written. But that's not the only answer. To dig a little deeper, there really are 2 very pronounced challenges that exist through WIOA. And according to the results of our survey, states will likely face two issues as they try their implementation, and that is kind of the understanding the broader definition of post-secondary recognized credentials and the requirement that eligible training providers report employment outcomes for all of their students in order to maintain eligibility. And let me address that latter one first. Private secondary schools, both for-profit and nonprofit, rarely have their student records included in state longitudinal data systems. And under the new WIOA, more data will be required on employment outcomes from these schools than they've in order to provide occupational training. And there are some states, including Washington, New Jersey, and Virginia, that have really collected data on a wide range of schools, and we hope that the requirements that these states have implemented could be replicated throughout. New Jersey, for example, passed a state law that includes information on what a training provider must provide in order to be placed on that list. The original statute was passed in 2005, so they've been on their game for a while. And they amended it in 2013, and the law basically states that any provider receiving state or federal workforce funds must be listed on the state eligible training provider list and must submit student records for all of their students, not just those receiving those federal funds. So New Jersey is really unique as the majority of states do not have such legislation in place, and we hope that others can really tap into the knowledge that New Jersey has established and maybe come up with some ways to think about how that governance structure could work within their own states and the political atmosphere of those states as well. And in regards to the kind of that broader definition of the post-secondary recognized credentials, in the past, the Department of Labor has issued their training and employment guidance letter that has information on how to review potential credentials, but the TEAGLE doesn't really talk about a definitive list of acceptable credentials, and I think that's always been the hang-up by many people. It's like, we need to know what credentials can be accepted, and I think it's almost an impossible task. And there's many reasons why, namely because there is so many credentials on the marketplace, and the credentialing marketplace is just big and messy. It can include degrees, certificates, licenses, badges, so on and so forth. And so the broader definition is just going to offer or add to the mix of this already cumbersome marketplace. But we're encouraged that there's a lot of work being done in this area to develop transparent standards that could demonstrate the quality and value of credentials. For example, the American National Standards Institute and George Washington University have been working on a project like this to try to determine the value of those credentials. And the U.S. Census Bureau released a report at the beginning of the year that introduced working definitions of alternative credentials, and those definitions were developed by the Federal Interagency Working Group on Expanded Measures of Enrollment and Attainment, which is GEMINA for short. So many of you have probably heard about that, but it helps try to sift through all of the levels and layers of the credentials and try to come up with some commonality and standards around those. So again, not an easy answer, but some states are further along than others.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Hannah Snyder, who is from California and is asking about the challenges in securing funding for the Utah Data Alliance.
Oh, that's a good question. In terms of securing funding from our Utah State Legislature, I guess I could speak to the biggest challenge is probably helping policymakers understand what it is that we are. I think our data, and this can be different in different states, but our database is a de-identified database. So we don't, for example, we cannot, for example, find a student in our database and go do an intervention with that student, for example. And so I think sometimes, and when we talk about data privacy and security, that's really difficult sometimes to understand the value of an SLDS when the data are de-identified. And so I think educating policymakers about what it is that we are was one really substantial hurdle for us, and then how we can help them once they understand what we are, and then the next logical question is, okay, so what can you do for the state of Utah? And so if I were speaking with other states about, and they're seeking state funding for this kind of project, I would put a lot of effort into helping them understand what an SLDS is, or what kind of data you have. I also think somebody mentioned it earlier in the call, and I think data privacy is probably something that states should be prepared to respond to. How do you ensure the privacy of your student data? Just like Jessica was saying, we only report at the minimum N sizes that are 10 or greater. In some cases, the N sizes are larger than that. The minimum N size is larger than that, but I think it's really important to be able to, from a policy perspective and from a technical perspective, be able to talk about how you're securing student data.
Thanks, Erica. So we are rounding up on the end of time, and it looks like we've answered most of the questions that folks have asked. There's a few left that we will follow up on offline, but since we are getting close to time, just would like to thank our presenters. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the information that you've shared with us today. And for folks who want more information, please check out the WDQC website at workforcedqc.org, and feel free to contact us anytime, and we're always happy to answer any questions or take a look and do some research on issues you have concerns about. So thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate your participation today.